Okay, so the second part here, I'm actually going to skip a little bit to get ahead to kind of put it into a thematic way rather than just going like, here's the certain pages to these certain pages. So I noticed that she has two flashbacks, one from her childhood and then one with her husband. So one of the things that we need to think about at this point in the novel, and this shows up more in chapters 3 and 4, is why she decides to focus on her childhood so much and why she does it now, this far into the novel. Um, I mean, we're already in page 43, and she finally, after the first chapter, is finally addressing a little bit about her life as a person back home. So her first flashback, my lodestone, the place I always thought of when people ask me why I became a biologist. So she's trying to say, here's how I became a psychologist. And the idea is that she is extremely introverted. And by being introverted, she doesn't really like to go hang out with people. She doesn't like to talk to people, likes to be alone. But she doesn't necessarily, she gets kind of bored, right? You can get bored when you're by yourself. So she decides to go outside and observe these creatures in this little pond that they have in their backyard. She calls it a kidney shaped pool on page 44. This is where she gives her sort of understanding of biodiversity and also transitional environments, right? So there's a purpose to it. It symbolizes not only her childhood and who she is as a person in the world that we live in, but she is also someone who's sort of overcompensating for some of the things that she's going through because she's isolated, because she's alone, because she doesn't really have any family, um, at least that she associates with, or wants to associate with, I should say. That's why she ends up being more into the creatures around her. Just like I used to have to do a lot of writing when I had no one to hang out with, and I just started writing like crazy, right? People have to compensate somehow. And it's very interesting on page 45. Inevitably, my focus netted from my parents' useless lectures of worry over my chronic introversion, as if doing so they could convince me they were still in charge. I didn't have enough or any friends, they reminded me. I didn't seem to make the effort. So what happens is she basically ignores everyone, and if they do want to hang out with her, she'll punch them. Boom. So clearly, she's someone who doesn't like to really hang out with other people per se. And they had their lives, that is, her parents had their lives, and I had mine. I like most of all pretending to be a biologist, and pretending often leads to becoming a reasonable facsimile of what you mimic, even if only from a distance. And so, of course, by becoming an observer of these transitional environments, this sort of helps her gain knowledge, right? Because now she wants to know more about them, and so she reads books on ecology or biology. This is at the bottom of page 45. I wanted to discover the information on my own first. As far as I was concerned, an only child, an expert in the uses of solitude. My observations of this miniature paradise could have continued forever, but unfortunately, that doesn't happen, right? Family's got to leave, and her mother's paintings are the only things that she can kind of keep with her, things that she doesn't really seem to care about. And she says something very interesting towards the bottom of page 46. There are certain kinds of deaths that one should not be expected to relive, certain kinds of connections so deep that when they are broken, you feel the snap of the link inside you. So, when she realized that she couldn't go back to this place, she realizes, okay, well, I can't do that anymore. But maybe, just maybe, I can go into this new place, into this new environment, and see what we can get done. And then she tries to connect it back to how it was with the tower. As we descended into the tower, I felt again for the first time in a long time the flush of discovery I had experienced as a child. But I also kept waiting for that snap. Notice I didn't do the snap. That's right. And I'm going to kind of skip ahead here for a minute. I will be coming back to these a little bit later as it speaks more to the uncanny. But I'm going to skip to page 55. And this is our first real look, although she has talked about it before. This is her first real um, mention of her husband. Again, she's already mentioned her husband once, but not to the extent that she does here. According to the records we had been shown, the first expedition reported nothing unusual in Area X, just pristine, empty wilderness. After the second and third expeditions did not return, and their fate became known, that is, they assumed they died or got stuck there, the expeditions were shut down for a time. This is very important when it comes to Chapter 3, when we talk about the lies of Area X, and we will get to that. When they began again, it was usually carefully chosen volunteers who might at least know the measure of the full risk. The 11th expedition in particular had been difficult, and personally difficult for me. Why? Which I have not been entirely honest thus far about. Wait a minute, what? She hasn't been telling us the whole truth? Well, we want to know the truth, right? Why were you lying to us? When someone lies to you, you ask them, why? Why would you lie to me? Why would you say that? Why would you have to lie? My husband was on the 11th expedition as a medic. All right, so a medic is someone who's like a doctor, might have a military background though, right? So that's very important. He might have a military background. He had never wanted to be a doctor, had always wanted to be in first response or working in trauma, a triage nurse in the field, as he put it. In other words, he wants to see the bad stuff, people getting shot, and he wants to help them. He wants to take the bullet out of their body. So someone who works in the ICU or even the emergency, right? Emergency room. So he's someone who gets the rush off of helping people in just the little things. Okay. So he was in the Navy before he switched over to the ambulance service. At first he hadn't said yes, had been unsure, but over time they convinced him. That is, they convinced him to go to this expedition. So, what we find out later is that perhaps, in some ways, he might have been controlled. Right now that we know what the psychologist has done and what some people have done before, perhaps we can learn more about it. I know this information might not be hard for anyone to find out, but I have hoped that in reading this account, you might find me a credible, objective witness, not someone who volunteered for Area X because of some event unconnected to the purpose of the expeditions. Okay. So what she's really saying is, and she says in the next sentence, but I'm going to sort of summarize it here, is that how could she not help it? Her husband was a part of the expedition. She is very much interested and intertwined into this expedition. In other words, her motivations may lie in her husband. Although she says, and in a sense this is still true, my husband's status as a member of the expedition is in many ways irrelevant to why I signed up. Or is it? Later on we'll find the truth. But how can I not be affected by Area X, if only through him? And here's when she talks about the uncanny experience of what it's like when someone comes home after a year and a half so unexpectedly. One night, about a year after he had headed for the border, as I lay alone in bed, I heard someone in the kitchen. I found my husband next to the refrigerator, and this is on page 56. Armed with a baseball bat, I left the room and turned on all the lights in the house. I found my husband next to the refrigerator, still dressed in his expedition clothes. I was speechless. I could only stare at him as if he were a mirage, as if he would dissipate into something or less than nothing. And we find out that they basically talk to each other in a way, but it's not like it was before, right? There's an odd calm about him. He had this sort of amnesia, and she says his amnesia was unnatural, very uncanny, right? Gone from him, too, seemed to be of any memory of how our marriage had began to disintegrate. Okay, let's stop there. So what do we learn about her? She is personally affected by her husband. I think no one was going to deny that. And now that we found out that their marriage wasn't going so well, maybe, just maybe, she thinks she can reconcile things by going into Area X, seeing her husband, and then helping him and being a part of this expedition. Maybe it'll bring them closer together. That's just an assumption one can make. Unfortunately, they try to have sex, and she says, I was trying to reclaim remnants of the man I had remembered, the one who, so unlike me, was outgoing, impetuous, and always wanted to be of use. But now I could find none of that in him. The whole time, his expression told me that he did not remember me, but only through a kind of fog. It made him more real, allowed me to pretend. So, the uncanny, something familiar yet unfamiliar. It's almost like she sees a ghost, right? It's not him. You know it's not him. The way that he was and the way that he is are two different things, which kind of mirrors what she says in chapter 1, right? If you remember, she says your identity of who you were in this other world and who you are in Area X are two different people. Very much so in the reverse. When you come back from Area X and come to the regular world, you are not your normal self. You're someone different, right? So that's kind of uncanny and a little unsettling. But you can only pretend for so long. That's when she basically calls them, calls the government and says, okay, well, my husband's here mysteriously. And apparently he dies 6 months later. Don't watch the movie because that's not going to happen in the movie. During all that time, I could never get beyond the mask, could never find the man I had known inside of him, not through my personal interactions, not through eventually watching the interviews with him, all of whom died of cancer as well. Whatever happened in Area X, he had not come back the same. Not really. So it's very important. Whatever happens in Area X changes you not only physically, but mentally, spiritually, in all the different aspects of who you are. And as we find out in chapter 5, we know the answer why. I won't spoil it for you. All I'll say is that it's almost like you see yourself again in a mirror, a double. So I'm going to kind of jog back to some of the ideas in here and kind of talk about some of the other ideas. So that was pages 56 to 58. So I'm going to kind of go backwards a little bit here in the next video and talk about the second half of this chapter because it's kind of crazy. Thank you.